I'm very excited to be here presenting to you all. I want to thank the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate program for inviting me to present to you. It is an honor. Here in Sweden, it's 9 p.m., so it's getting dark here while it's still light where you are. I work as a linguist. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Linguistics at Stockholm University. I have primarily focused on deaf children and their writing skills, their development, and I've done research related to bilingual acquisition, second language acquisition. So my title, Breaking the Waves, is not from this famous Danish independent movie that you see the picture of here, but it's more for breaking the norms. I think about my journey throughout academia and some of the issues I've faced and how I have broken the waves, so to speak. I've broken some norms that I have faced. And as a deaf person interacting with hearing people, I've broken a variety of norms that maybe have existed. And I study phonology. I discuss sound waves in phonology studies. So not only spoken languages have phonology, but sign languages do as well. But today I'll talk about three main parts of my life, beginning with my childhood, as I grew and my educational experience. I then will talk about my journey into academia and how I became a PhD and a linguist specifically. And thirdly, I will talk about my own personal reflections of my journey. I think this is probably the most fun presentation that I have prepared for. Most of my presentations have been very scientific or linguistic focused, but this is more about my life, my personal life. So you probably are familiar with the movie Back to the Future. That's what I have felt like preparing for this presentation, thinking about my life and from a child and how I became interested in linguistics and decided to become a linguist. So this picture you see here is me as a 3-year-old. I was born hearing and lost my hearing when I was approximately 2 years of age. My parents are hearing. I lost my hearing due to meningitis when I became ill. I then lost my hearing over that time. When I became deaf, that began my journey at 2 years of age as a deaf person. And if I hadn't become deaf, I might not have become a researcher into sign language and deaf individuals and how they learn and develop. Now you see here my family. My father, who's hearing, my older brother, who is also hearing, and then the picture next to that is my mother, who is also hearing. I searched for pictures showing all 4 of us, but it seemed to always be either my father or my mother taking a picture of the other 3 of us, never all 4 of us together. Again, I was born hearing and then became deaf. And my parents were unsure of how to communicate, how we could all communicate at that time, but they decided that we would learn sign language. My family was involved, including my grandparents. I think about the age of 4, I remember being in the living room and having the whole family, circled around and all of us learning to sign. We had a deaf tutor that would come and a hearing person as well that would come and teach the family to sign, but we all did that together. And I am very thankful to my parents for learning to sign. And they the whole family didn't necessarily become fluent per se, but they could communicate with me. In Sweden, they had a sign language program for parents, hearing parents of deaf children. They could get a free sign language education, take classes, paid by the government, which was really great, a great service to have. When I first went to kindergarten, the first place I went, my mother was not satisfied because there were only a few deaf children in the one class in the school, and so she decided to move me to a second school, and it was a very dominant hearing class, hearing environment, and so my mom moved me to a third location, a third school. There were many deaf children, so we all could sign together. I was able to grow as a deaf kid, communicating with my peers. So once I finished kindergarten, I went to a deaf school in Stockholm called the Manila School. This is the sign for Manila School. It was a beautiful old campus. It's the oldest deaf school in Sweden, founded in 1809. I started school there in 1983. And at that time, Sweden decided to institute bilingual education in the deaf schools. And so this program began at the Manila School, same time I entered. I started the school at the same time that bilingual education began. So I progressed through the Manila School. There were probably approximately 150 students. I had a nice time. I learned a lot during my time there. And I felt normal. I didn't feel different in any way. I could communicate with my peers, my friends, my teachers through sign language. It was comfortable. Of course, everything was not perfect. Of course, you know, I began at the Manila School at the same time that they began the bilingual education program. So everything wasn't perfect, and it improved as time went on. But for me, the important thing was to have access to language. I felt like a normal person in my school. My experiences at the Manila School were the first times that I started thinking about how deaf students or deaf people receive education or learn. Some of my peers could read better than others or write better than others, and I was curious as to why that could be, why there were so many variations between us all. I would often actually interpret for my classmates or my friends. You know, maybe if there were, we were watching a movie with captions, I might interpret some of the captions for them. I graduated from the deaf school. And in Sweden, the educational system is somewhat different from the American educational system. In Sweden, we have something called gymnasium. This is the sign we use for that. You could compare it to a mixture of high school and college in the US, kind of like the last 2 years of high school, first 2 years of college life. That would be like gymnasium in Sweden. So I went to Stockholm and moved to a small town called Örebro. This is the sign for that. And really, Örebro was the center for deaf life. And deaf individuals from all over Sweden come to Örebro. there are some like mainstream programs throughout Sweden, but if you want to be really immersed in deaf culture, Örebro is the place to be. So the white dot is Stockholm, and the red dot on the map is Örebro. So you can see the location of the two. So interestingly, I visited Rochester some years ago. It was very nice. And when I visited Rochester, it felt very similar to the American Örebro. A lot of people can sign here in Rochester. There are a lot of deaf individuals here. It's very similar to Örebro. When you're walking in the city, you often will see other people sign with each other, and lots of people know sign language. So it's a funny comparison of the two cities. So I was in Örebro for 4 years, and it's slightly different from American, the US graduation caps. Our cap is a little bit different. You can see here in this picture. But of course, when I finished gymnasium, there was a ceremony and celebration and all such things. This is one picture from that event. So while I was studying Örebro, it was a good time. I was able to meet a variety of people, and I was able to, well, of course, I did party and was involved in sports and had a variety of interests, arts and books and music and movies and all sorts of entertainment. But I did also focus on school as well, and my work. I did study while I was there, and I did start thinking about what I wanted to do in the future. One option that I considered was becoming a photographer. You see this picture here, it's one of my own photos that I took back when I was considering becoming a photographer. I then switched to advertising, decided I might want to go into advertising of some sort, enjoyed art and business, maybe a mix of that. Actually, my first barrier to a professional career happened at this time. I had a student advisor that I was talking with about what I wanted to do once I finished gymnasium and whether I wanted to study at a university or go directly to work, etc. So this advisor asked me what I wanted to do. I told them that I wanted to work in the advertising arena in some way, and they told me that I could not. And I was shocked. I asked why I could not. And they turned around back to me and asked, how could you communicate? How can you communicate with hearing people out in the world? How are you going to do that? Actually, I had grown up thinking quite the opposite. My dad always supported me and encouraged me that I could do whatever I wanted to in the future. I could be whatever I wanted to do. Even though it might be difficult for me, I could do it. This was my first experience with this type of barrier, being told that I couldn't, and this type of discrimination because I was a deaf person.
Okay, so for the second part here, I'll move on to discuss my journey into academia and how I got into academia. So I was considering my options. Again, I was thinking something in the field of art. So I decided to go to Stockholm University in their Department of Linguistics. And several departments at Stockholm University have programs that focus on sign language linguistics, Swedish sign language linguistics. And there was a group at Stockholm University. So I thought I might be interested in that. I applied for it, and I thought I might just study it for 1 year and then move on to something else. So I started my studies at Stockholm University and I was hooked. I was incredibly fascinated by what I was studying. We were studying sign language, and of course, sign language is my own language. We were also studying Swedish. And again, I didn't plan to stay for very long at Stockholm University, but once I got in, I wanted to continue with my studies there. I didn't want to leave again. And then I met a professor, Dr. Kristina Svartholm, who is just fantastic. She was very supportive of me. And after I finished my master's in Swedish, she asked me if I wanted to pursue a PhD. And I was very uncertain about it. I thought that maybe I would go to the US instead, or I would go elsewhere in Europe. I wasn't sure about staying in Stockholm. But I gave it some consideration and I decided that I would enter a PhD program. And my apologies, I forgot, of course, I mentioned Dr. Kristina Svartholm, as well as Dr. Brita Bergman. They would later become my PhD supervisors. My Professor Svartholm encouraged me and was extremely supportive of me. One example of that is around 2002, I received an invitation from Christian Rothman inviting me to a deaf academics conference in Austin, Texas. And that was the same year that I was applying for the PhD program. So I said that I was interested, and Dr. Kristina, my supervisor, said absolutely I should go to it, that it would be very worth it, and it would be important to build my network and to meet other people at this conference. So I decided to go, and she helped me receive funding so that I could fly to Austin, Texas for the conference. And the conference was a wonderful experience. I met so many smart people. I got to interact with so many academics at this conference. And the conference only lasted 2 or 3 days. I don't remember exactly how long it was, but I stayed for about a week. And I got to meet many different people there, from PhD students, master's level students, faculty, all of whom were deaf. It was a very eye-opening experience for me, and it was really a strengthening experience for me. In the past, I had mostly been the only deaf person, and the only deaf person I knew who was pursuing a PhD, so it was wonderful to meet other people who were like me. As a PhD student, I focused on Swedish as a second language for deaf Swedish children. And I was not under the Department of Linguistics, but I was under a different department, which is called the Scandinavian Languages Department at Stockholm University, just a different department. And it was very difficult because I was the only deaf person. There was one other deaf person at Stockholm University as well, and a faculty who knew sign language, but everyone else was hearing. It was a predominantly hearing environment. Other students were studying Scandinavian languages, Swedish languages. They all had different focuses. And I'm very grateful for the experience that I had before this at the conference in Austin, so that I knew that there were other deaf people who were in academia pursuing their PhDs, and that there were other deaf people internationally, and that gave me some of the strength to continue in my studies. And fortunately, I am somewhat of an introvert, so I don't need to constantly be around other people, and I don't need that much socialization. But I think if I was, I would have thought about quitting the program. But as it was, I was able to pursue it and get through it. So there was then another Deaf Academics Conference, but this time in Stockholm, Sweden, in 2006. myself and Dr. Johanna Mesh, and another woman, Hilda Howland. The three of us collaborated to host this conference. And it was a very good experience for me to host a conference, organize a conference, gather people. I learned a lot from that experience of putting this conference together. And it was a very new experience for me that forced me to learn a lot. But again, I met many wonderful people, many deaf scientists, and also met new deaf people and further developed my network. And here, I think it's important to have two networks. One network of deaf academics, so that we can share common experiences about being deaf, share ideas, and interact with each other in that network. And then a separate network of scientists who are in the same field. So I think it's important to have both of those networks so that you can move between them because they have slightly different focuses. But this conference really helped me a lot. So I progressed through my PhD, and in 2010, I defended my PhD. And the night before, I was very nervous. The Swedish tradition is for the PhD defense to look a little bit different than it does in the US. In Sweden, at Stockholm University, dissertation defenses are held in very large auditoriums. There are researchers, faculty, students, family. Deaf friends also came to mind, deaf colleagues. So the auditorium was full. There were maybe 100 people at my PhD defense. And it took about 2 hours. So I sat in front with the opponent who was asking me questions and who I was having the discussion with about my PhD dissertation. And my PhD dissertation was on bilingual deaf children and how deaf children learn Swedish. And I'll talk more about that later. So this was a very challenging experience, but it also taught me a lot, and I grew a lot from this experience of discussing science in sign language, working with interpreters for my PhD defense. It was a really great experience. And after my defense was done, the Swedish tradition is that after the PhD defense is done, everyone proceeds to almost a waiting room while the committee makes their decision. And of course, they almost always approve the defense and pass the defense. If not, you would have to have done a very, very poor job, but typically it gets caught before that point. But I was still very nervous. And then when they came out and announced their decision, of course, everyone does cheers and there's a celebration there and a reception. And at that point, I felt like the academic door was open to me. I had my PhD, there were new opportunities for me, and there were new people that I could meet. And there were many people who were interested in my research, who I met at my PhD defense. And while I was going through my PhD, of course, I was completely focused on my dissertation, on solving the problem, and on my research question. And I had a very narrow focus at that time. So I didn't notice the other people who were interested in my research, and honestly, I didn't expect it. So that was an interesting moment for me to realize how many people were very interested in my research. So the Swedish Stockholm University tradition is also to have a celebratory reception after the PhD defense at City Hall, which is the same place where the Nobel Prize is awarded. So we had a reception there. This is a picture of me with my wife, wearing my formal Swedish traditional suit. And this is a picture of me with my supervisor as well as my opponent. And you can see that I have this crown on my head, which looks like the same sort of crown that Julius Caesar would have worn. And that's the tradition at Stockholm University, is after receiving a PhD, you also wear this crown as well as the diploma. So it was a really wonderful experience and a wonderful memory to look back on. Okay, so now I'll talk about my work today. I'm in the Department of Linguistics, and there are two groups in the Department of Linguistics, one that focuses on sign language and the other that focuses on multilingualism within the deaf and hard of hearing community. So we just took this group picture. It was very hard to get all of us in the same room at the same time. People are always off to conferences or busy with other things, so we're fortunate to be able to get this picture of all of us. And 3 people are hearing. They're circled right here in blue. 3 members of this section are hearing. 5 of us have PhDs. We're circled in yellow here. 4 of us are deaf who have PhDs, and 1 hearing person has a PhD. And then there is also 1 PhD student who's circled in green, as well as 1 who just started. So it's a really great group to work with. It's very accessible. Everyone is very smart and hardworking, and I really enjoy working with them. I'll talk a bit about my research that I've been doing recently. And if you remember, I started thinking about this problem when I was in deaf school, thinking about deaf Swedes, how literate they are, how we can improve their access to spoken and written Swedish. So for my first project, after my dissertation, I wanted to study deaf children and study how they acquire written Swedish. And again, I wanted to look at bilingual students in a bilingual school. So I collected writing samples from Swedish children. And I used a second language acquisition theory, which is called Processability Theory. And Processability Theory applies to L2 learners of Swedish or English or German or any other language. They follow specific grammatical structures that they learn in sequence. So a student learns stage 1 first and then builds on it with stage 2 and so on. So a student needs to master stage 2 before they can move on to stage 3, for example. And if you're curious to know more about this, I would be happy to talk with you more after the seminar. Feel free to send me an email or we can schedule a virtual meeting. I know right now I'm going to give a very brief summary of my research, but I'd be happy to talk more about it after the seminar. And my findings was that these are all deaf children who primarily use sign language. And I found that they have a similar grammatical development to hearing individuals who learn Swedish spoken language as an L2. So they learn more simple structures such as morphemes first, and then more complex sentence structures later. So it's the opposite from most written research on deaf children, which is often more focused on the errors that deaf children make and more of a deficit model. And often those studies conclude that in comparison with hearing children, deaf children's writing is worse or behind in some way. So again, that's reinforcing the hearing L1 norm, and I want to disrupt that. So I want to create a different norm for deaf children to recognize that their way of learning Swedish is appropriate for them. So another project that I was involved with that also taught me a lot. Again, I started by studying spoken and written Swedish, and bilingual children from a bilingual perspective. But I wanted to continue that research, and I needed some sort of assessment of sign language. So I looked for something like that, and I found the ASL SRT, the sentence reproduction test, which Dr. Peter Hauser, with his collaborators, developed. And I met Peter, and we talked more about it, and I explained that I was interested in developing a similar test for Swedish Sign Language. So I received a small amount of funding to go visit RIT and visit Peter Hauser, and then for him to come visit Stockholm University around 2013. so that we could develop the Swedish sentence reproduction test. And the sentence reproduction test means that for the test, the person will sit and watch a video of someone signing a sentence, and then the participant is expected to sign it back to a video. And so that's the picture that you can see here of the woman signing back to the laptop. So the results of this study seem to show that deaf children from deaf families or deaf children who have deaf parents, comparing to deaf children who have hearing parents, we found that deaf children of deaf parents typically have higher scores in the Swedish SRT. And we expect that that's because those children have sign language from birth and they use sign language every day in the house, compared to deaf children of hearing parents who may or may not use sign language at home. And we've used the SRT for Swedish Sign Language in a number of different tests that we've done here. So I'm very grateful to have that from Peter, and very grateful that we're able to use that in our research. So this is the third project, and this was the result of a grant application that I was awarded. We developed a corpus of second language Swedish signers, so learning Swedish Sign Language as an L2. This is in collaboration with Dr. Johanna Mesh, and this is a 3-year project where we're studying hearing people who are learning Swedish Sign Language as an L2. And my focus so far, again, has been literacy of deaf children, and then learning Swedish as a second language, and now learning Swedish Sign Language as a second language. So again, these are all in the second language acquisition sphere. And so I'm bringing my experience from these other second language learning projects into this new project. And I hope from this to also broaden my research experiences and broaden my expertise. And it has been a challenge, but I found that one way to move into new fields and to learn new knowledge is to bring the expertise that I already have into a project where I can learn new skills and experiences.
I'm going to show you a film. It's hearing individuals signing. I'll show it to you now. You can see that she did a good job of trying to sign what she was trying to express. So we filmed a variety of people and have created this corpus. We did an analysis using Elan. It's for multimodal analysis in linguistics. You can upload videos and analyze them with the software. We first annotate or code with gloss, and then we have the variety of videos. And if you want to focus on structure, you can do that. One area that focused is mouthing. L2 learners tend to use more mouth movements. And then comparing them to the L1 control group and how they use mouthing. So when you see mouthing, we're talking about something that is borrowed from the other language. So house, when you sign it in ASL, if you mouth the word, the English word house, that's what we mean by mouthing. When you see mouthing, that means they mouth the full word or term, and then reduced mouthing is that they don't mouth the whole word. For example, one Swedish word that we have, well, I'll use the ASL sign for meeting or meet. You don't meet ing, you just meet. It's reduced mouthing. That's one example. Deaf people don't always use mouthing. In the second language acquisition area, we call it transfer when you borrow from one language and it intrudes into the other, and that can be seen in mouthing. So currently, a new project that I'm very excited about is with Ingela. She's the PI responsible for the project. It will be about $500,000 from the Swedish Research Council. And it'll be 2020 through 2023. They also have gotten a new PhD student, Nora Dugan, who grew up in Ireland but is now living in Sweden. She is deaf, a young person that will be coming to work with us. We'll be doing some research on deaf refugees, specifically related to their language use. And maybe language deprivation, maybe if they didn't have access to language growing up, etc. There are a variety of things that we'll be looking at. So I'm excited to get into these research projects. We have two focuses. One will be how individuals communicate and interact in school, for example, in the classroom. The second focus will be on writing and also looking at language deprivation and the critical period hypothesis, or CPH. Okay, now for the third part related to my reflections. While I was preparing for this presentation, I was thinking about myself and my life and what I have experienced over time. And it has not always been easy. I've had to do some hard work, but there have also been fun times. It's up and down, ebbs and flows. Primarily of importance is finding your collaborators. I have had several very valuable collaborators over time, both hearing and deaf, those who sign and don't sign, those from Sweden, those from America. A few examples I have here from Stockholm University, Ingela Holmstrom. She's deaf, an educator. And then Johanna Mesh, who I've mentioned at Stockholm University as well. She's a linguist. And then Emil Holmer from Linköping University. He's more focused on psychology. Then there's Matthew Dye from RIT. He's a psychologist as well. Peter Hauser from Rochester, here at RIT, a psychologist also. And Christian Rathman from Humboldt University in Berlin. He's a sign linguist. I think also it's important to have collaborators in a variety of fields, not only within your field. For example, linguists like myself. It's important to look outside of your field and find collaborators in education, or like I mentioned, psychology, a variety of fields that could help you grow your own research and your own career. Now, I mentioned the ups and downs, but it's important that you find a way to enjoy your work. Particularly if you are deaf and work in a hearing world, you don't want to always be faced with challenges continuously every day. You need to find a place to be where you can have the authority and ability to break those norms that I talked about. For example, in 2013, I went to visit Peter Hauser's lab in Rochester and had a really nice time just meeting several new people, deaf and hearing both. And during that same trip here to the US, I went to visit Matt Dye when he was at the University of Illinois. And I had a great time visiting him and learning from him and his colleagues, and building collaborations for the future, like that test project that I talked about previously with Peter. And oh goodness, I see these pictures. This is really BC, meaning before Corona. You know, we're all, our arms around each other, we're all close to each other, less than 6 feet apart. That was a good time. Now for the conclusion and this final picture that you see here. You know, your refrigerator at home. Typically, you might have kids' pictures, art, maybe food coupons or takeout menus and things like that on your refrigerator. And I have different magnets and different things you can see here, some from my travels. And one that always comes to mind is this one here: be yourself, everyone else is already taken. Oscar Wilde. Yes, he's a famous writer, a famous author, and I wanted to share that in closing. And thank you. If you have questions or want to know more, please feel free to email me.